Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Media Tech International Lecture Series. Thanks for your participation. Now, welcome the moderator, Dr. Long Yingtai.
Good afternoon. 大家午安。那同时我要特别说大家午安，在隔壁有一个房间，大概有100个人，他没有办法进来，真的是不好意思。可是我想要让隔壁房间的朋友们了解说，我们记得你们在我们旁边。那as usual, first of all, I have to say a word of thanks to many people behind the scene who have made all this possible at all. First of all, this series is made possible by MediaTek 联发科整个的支持，才可能容许我们把新观念带进来。所以我们要非常感谢联发科对于台湾的未来有这样的一个愿景。I also like to thank Commonwealth Magazine Group, China Telecom, China Times Online, and China Times newspaper, the United Daily newspaper, and I thank ICRT for all the support they gave us, and special thanks to the German Department of Suzhou University and the German Cultural Center of Taipei, who have been very supportive for everything that we have been doing. 然后今天在场的呢，真的有好些贵宾。First of all, among us is the former Minister of Education, Dr. 曾志朗，曾部长，谢谢你来。Among us is also the director of the German Cultural Center, Mr. Jürgen Gerbeck. We also have the representative of the Singapore Trade Office, Dr. 柯兴智，柯代表，谢谢您。And please also welcome the representative of the Indonesian Economic and Trade Office to Taipei, Mr. Ivan Katabrata. Thank you very much for being here. And last but definitely not least is Mr. Yu Mingduo, representing 联发科，玉先生 ，Thank you very much. I didn't want to go up there because I want to leave all the time to Julian Wemmerling today. So, Mr. Julian Nida Wemmerling is not the first time in Taiwan. He was here in the year 2003. The fact that he is coming back probably shows to us that he has taken a liking to our troubled island. Just 10 minutes ago, I was trying to put the troubles we have with our democracy in a nutshell to him. Julian Nida Wemmerling was born in 1954 in Munich, Germany. He studied philosophy, which I don't understand, physics, which I don't understand, mathematics, which I failed, all the way from primary school to college. And he studied political science. That's something that we all are learning. And he obtained his doctorate degree in philosophy at the University of Munich. He's one of the most important philosopher in Europe today. And during Mr. Schröder's administration, he was appointed to be the first cultural minister of Germany in 2001. When we say first, it means that in Germany that in different provinces or states, Bundesländer, they have individual ministers of culture. But nationwide, on a national level, that was the first time after the Nazi time, that you had a national ministry of culture. So Mr. Wormelin was the first national minister of culture in 2001. At the moment, he's chair professor for political theory and philosophy at the University of Munich. He has had a lot of publications, most of them in German, which I don't understand because it's too difficult. When it's translated into English, it's hard for me because I don't understand. It's too difficult. And very happily, he has one of his books translated into Chinese just the end of last year. And if you're daring enough, you can get a copy of that to see what his works are on. And today we are going to listen to about 15 minutes of Wormelin's talk, followed by half an hour of dialogue between me and him. And then we open up the floor to the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, this is really a happy event. This is the launching event for the MediaTek lecture series. We are going to have a lot more exciting speakers to come, but this is really the kickoff program for all the possibilities. We're looking forward to that. Ladies and gentlemen, let us give Wormelin warmest applause that's possible.
Thank you very much for this friendly introduction. It's a great honor for me to be the second time here in this building, invited the second time by the same foundation and by my colleague, if I may say, Dr. Lung Ying Tai. In this building, there is not much change as far as I see, but probably in the society, there's lots of dynamics in Taiwan and many changes going on. And probably, even if there are some miles in between, there are common backgrounds and common challenges between this region here and the Middle European region. So, for example, both regions have the experience of a long-term competence and competition in being confronted with two quite different political systems. Europe was split into two parts since the Second World War, and Europe has overcome this state only 15 years ago, 17 years ago, depending which year you take as the turning point. Here in East Asia, there is still a situation of two quite different political systems, even if the conditions are different regarding the situation in Europe for many decades. I think this is a common context within which we discuss the question of democracy and its challenges. Then both regions face new challenges because of the development of what is called usually globalization. Sometimes it is said there are winners of globalization, like Taiwan and China and India, Brazil and others, and there are losers. And amongst the losers, there are the old European social states or social welfare states. Well, if you look at the figures, this is not quite true. For example, the proportion of the worldwide trade that the German economy has grown during the last years. Germany, for the moment, is in economic terms a winner of globalization. Obviously a winner. For the first time since Second World War, Germany is the leading nation in export economy, in front of the United States and in front of Japan. So it's more complex than one might at first sight think. We have a common problem which might be called demography, if I see this rightly. So the change in society, more elderly, less young, less kids. This is something what in East Asia is a problem like in many European countries. For example, Macau and Hong Kong are among those who have less kids in the world. Macau, I think, is leading in this respect. And then we face a challenge regarding the role of cultural and language communities within the democratic and the political systems. In Europe, this is largely due to migration. In East Asia, it is also largely due to migration. Some of these migrations decades ago. And maybe we have not only common challenges, but also common perspectives. And if my argument in this lecture is right, the common perspective is a global, civil and civilized society. There might be some discussion about this idea, but since the foundation tells that it's the idea which changes the world, I am optimistic that we can discuss such an idea. Now, Mrs. Lung Ying Tai has asked me to speak in English, and as you already have realized, my English is far from perfect, so I speak slowly, and I think that also part of the audience is not perfect in English, so this is a basis of communication, so you should speak slowly too, then later on if we have this discussion, and it's easier for the interpreter in Chinese. I try something which is not common in talks of this kind. I try to bridge science and politics. In a way, this is the old Platonic idea that politics should at least partly be based on scientific insights. And this is a difficult task because there are scientists specialized in their fields and there are citizens who have to decide. And scientists, also very good scientists, are not always apt to translate their scientific results into a language that can be understood by all or at least many citizens. This is what I'm going to try in this lecture. So don't be afraid if you look in the overview on my lecture and you see some terms which are not clear from the beginning. I try to bridge the gap between science, political science, decision theory, philosophy on the one hand, and questions that are quite essential to democracy in general, and are questions that every citizen should be, at least should be, interested in. So, in a way, it's an intellectual adventure trip which we are going to undertake during the next 40 minutes. The first question I want to discuss is, what is democracy? It seems that this can easily be answered. Democracy is a political system in which voters decide who is in government Full stop. This is wrong. Obviously wrong. I give two examples. One example is ancient Greek. Do I have to speak more loudly? I can do it. No? Okay. One example is ancient Greek. The polis culture in Athens, the first historically verified example of true democracy. But you have to know that this is called democracy in ancient Greek, in Athens especially during the Periclean times, is a very radical form of democracy. If Plato criticizes democracy, he criticizes a custom that by chance the citizens in Athens decided who does or fills in which government position or which position as a judge. Elections were seen as an element of aristocracy, because in aristocracy the best govern, and not everybody. And if you elect, the best should govern. So this is, in the terminology of the ancient Greek time, not democracy. So we live, in Platonic words, in an aristocracy or an oligarchy, depending on the quality of the personality in government. So what is democracy? Now there is a very interesting scientific analysis that backs my position that democracy is not, or let's say, not primarily a collective decision procedure. That democracy is based on norms and values far going beyond a mere decision procedure. And it is, on my account, kind of a scandal also in science that these results are not very well known, not even amongst colleagues in Germany or in France or in Italy. I suspect the same is true in Taiwan, and therefore I always bring these results, and these results are, in my view, very interesting. Now the question is, democracy as a decision procedure, does this work? And my thesis is that democracy cannot be based, or not primarily be based, on a collective decision procedure. And I use the results of a certain branch of present-day scientific analysis, and this is called collective choice theory. It is a more or less logical analysis of certain properties that different modes of collective decision-making have. And now if you think of democracy, you want that a collective decision-making meets basic principles of rationality and democracy. Some basic principles. For example, you do not allow that a dictator is in charge of every decision. Dictator would be a person who decides every issue based on his or her own preferences. So this would be, obviously, not be a democracy. So if you have a dictator, this is incompatible with democracy. Second, don't look for the moment to this. Second, if everybody agrees on some issue, how this issue should be decided on, then in a democracy we expect that this is also realized. Okay? So we have two minimal conditions. No dictator And if there is a consensus, this should be realized. These are not strong conditions, are very weak, are minimal conditions. Now I tell a third condition. If you choose between where to go to holiday, and you think, well, should I visit Germany or the United States? Well, you say, I have a strong preference for Germany. But then your kid asks you, well, but I would like to go to Italy. And then you think about, well, I have a preference for the United States, for Germany. If the alternative is the United States, and then you can put Italy, for example, at the first, and say, well, Italy is even better than Germany. Or you can say, Germany is better than Italy, Italy is better than United States. But what should not happen is that you change your preference between United States and Germany only because there is a third alternative. This would show that you somehow are irrational. Okay? Is this understandable? Okay. Then, last condition, and we are through. Everybody in a democracy should have those preferences he likes. Full stop. In a democracy, preferences should not be forbidden, to put it in other terms. A democracy allows for every preference, more or less. So these are 4 minimal requirements, very, very minimal requirements. No dictatorship, the unanimity rule, a minimal rational requirement, and preference sovereignty. Sovereignty of choosing your preference for your own. And now there is an economist and philosopher called Kenneth Arrow who found out late 50s, beginning 60s, that these 4 requirements, minimal requirements for democracy, cannot be met simultaneously. There is no decision rule that meets these 3 minimal requirements of democracy. None. So, this is a result that should make us think anew about democracy. So, I have put it in the short version. Rule of unanimity. If there is a consensus, this should be realized. Rule of sovereignty. Everybody can have preferences he wants or she wants. Rule of non-dictatorship. There shouldn't be a dictator. And fourth, the rule of irrelevant alternatives, though a minimal rationality requirement. If there is a third alternative, don't choose the other, only because there is a third one. And the theorem, Arrow's impossibility theorem, tells these 4 conditions cannot be met simultaneously. Or to put it in other terms, you should not base such a system as democracy, with all its implications, exclusively on certain modes of decision-taking, of collective decision-taking. This can't be the basis. There is an additional aspect to this. Think of the following. It's not only a thought experiment, it's reality in many parts of the world. Many of us, grown up in democracies or living in democracies, think, well, as far as the majority rule is working, everything is fine in democracy. But now think of a state or a society partitioned into different ethnicities. And let's make it easy. We have a society with 2 and only 2 ethnicities, ethnic groups. One group is about 60% of the population, and the other is about 40% of the population. And both groups are well organized, so both groups have a party that represents their interests. What happens in such a state? The party of the bigger ethnic groups wins every election, wins every election. Is there any reason for the party who represents the smaller ethnic group to be loyal to such a political system? To do this, what is decided by majority rule, majority voting of this government or the legislation? I would say no. They have no chance to come to government because both ethnic groups are well organized and the bigger ethnic group wins every conflict. So such a state, such a society based merely on a procedure of collective decision-taking cannot work. It can only work if every relevant group has the chance to realize its interests, have the chance even to be in power or to be integrated into the power system. So there must be a more basic constitutive consensus on the rules, principles, norms and values of democracy in order that you can expect that there is loyalty. Loyalty binding everybody to the decisions of the government, to the decisions of the legislation, and so on and so forth. And this is true not only for such a conflict between ethnic groups, but also, for example, if you have a bipartisan system, one bigger than the other, one stronger than the other, no common values, no common principles, no overlapping consensus, I will go into it a little bit later, then the legitimization of the democratic system erodes. This you can, I think, already realize in one of the eldest, maybe the eldest democracy in the world, in the United States presently. And I don't know how it is in Taiwan. Now, there is another theorem. I will make this very short, but this is also interesting. It's called the Gibbard-Satterthwaite theorem. There are some students who may know this theorem. It's called because Gibbard and Satterthwaite, independently from each other, found this out, published it almost in the same period of time, but independently. And this theorem roughly says the following. Whatever rule of collective decision-taking is established, none of these rules is strategy-free or manipulation-free. This is almost the same. I explain the term. Strategy-free is a collective decision procedure if nobody has an interest to put in false preferences, to put in other preferences than the person has in fact, in order to get one's real preferences fulfilled. So if a mode of collective decision-taking is not strategy-free, there is an incentive to lie. There is an incentive to give the impression to have other preferences than you in fact have, in order to get these preferences realized that you in fact have. This is the problem of strategy dependency or strategy inclination. Yeah? And seemingly a wholly different problem is the problem of manipulation. A system of, or a rule of collective decision-taking is not free of manipulation if it is possible to get different results, not changing the preferences of the persons who gave in their votes and so on, but only in changing the mode, for example, when is decided what or something like this. So it is the person somehow in charge of the formal decision taking that then decides what the results of this procedure is. And if you look carefully to the results of parliamentary discussion and parliamentary decisions, you find out that a vast amount of decisions has results not depending on the preferences of the deputies, not depending on the rule that is established how to decide, but depending on the chairman, and on the procedure in which this rule is applied. So this is the problem of manipulation. And the dual result of Gibbard and Satterthwaite is that there is no rule of collective decision-taking that is free of manipulation and strategy. So whichever rule you establish, the simple majority rule, the qualified majority rule, a majority rule with veto options, a majority rule with minority rights, and so on. There are different rules established in every democracy. Whatever you establish, you have the problem of strategic and manipulating behavior. If everybody optimizes his or her own interests. So this result is also quite relevant for what democracy is and what the constitutive elements of democracy are or should be, how we understand democracy. And my argument is, now I skip the next in order to not to go out of time. My argument is that we should understand democracy in a more substantive manner, base democracy on three basic values: freedom, equality, and solidarity. These are the three basic values of modern democracy, maybe not of the democracy in ancient times, but of modern democracy, and I will try to explain these three values and norms. The first, freedom. Freedom is based on a certain anthropology, so an anthropological account of what man is, what human existence means. Freedom is not just freedom to do what you like. Freedom is the freedom of an autonomous life. Freedom, as I understand it, is the idea which changes the world, and changed the world, in fact, in the 16th century in Europe, and later on, is the idea that persons are responsible for their own lives. They decide what the content, the sense, the meaning of their life is. And politics has to look for fulfilling those requirements that are necessary in order to live an autonomous life. If you look to the Constitution, now I have not looked to the Constitution of Taiwan, but you can look to the Constitution of Taiwan and maybe you could verify it. There are articles, mostly these articles are at the beginning of a democratic constitution, that is exclusively about individual freedoms. Freedom of speech, for example. Freedom in the sense that nobody is allowed to take your life. And so on and so forth. So in the German constitution, the first 19 articles of the constitution are exclusively about personal freedom. And I understand this as a result of a certain anthropological approach. We have a respect regarding every single person. This person has to lead his or her life. She is autonomous, more or less autonomous, as we know, but she should be as autonomous as possible. We respect this, and this means also that politics is not responsible for happiness. It's your life, you see? So the utilitarianism is the wrong basis of politics. Politics should not try to make persons happy. It should try to make persons autonomous, give them the possibility to live their lives, which they find adequate and good. And then in the end it turns out that this life is not happy, then it's not happy. But this is not the responsibility of the politician or the political system overall, by and large. Yeah? For example, we have many rules in every lawful system that does not allow, for example, to take drugs or to drive without a security belt and so on and so forth. So it's a difficult question whether this is compatible with this central norm of liberty, because I can, for example, go into the mountains and take a very dangerous road or pathway. It's my freedom, it's my liberty to do this. Nobody is allowed to forbid this. And so why is it forbidden to drive without a security belt? It's philosophically not easy to say, and the same is true for drug taking. But let's skip these problems which exist there. In general, the first value, central value of democracy is freedom understood as autonomy, and corresponding to this, respect. The second norm is about equality. It was in Europe Thomas Hobbes, the first in modern times, after the end of the medieval age, who said, everybody is equal. There is no natural difference between human individuals that establishes a natural order of rule, a natural order of slavery, as Aristotle thought in ancient times. There is no nature, human nature, that gives man the right to rule over women and free men over slaves. Human nature is such that they are basically equal. There are lots of differences, writes Thomas Hobbes. Differences in intelligence and strength, physical strength, and so on and so forth. But these differences do not justify a certain system of natural rule. There is no natural rule, because human beings are equal. So every form of political rule has to be justified in front of every singular citizen, every singular person. This is the basic norm of democracy, equality. I have written something about the question how the first norm, freedom, and the second norm, equality, are correlated. My thesis is that one does not even understand the second or the first if you do not take them together from the beginning. And to put it shortly, the argument is like this: the normative basis of democracy is equal respect, equal autonomy, equal freedom. This is the normative basis, not a decision procedure. That can also be fulfilled, for example, in a dictatorship. I'm quite certain that during the time in which Adolf Hitler was the dictator in Germany, every election would have kept him in government. But this wouldn't legitimize him, because it would not be a democratic order. because it was not based on equal respect, equal freedom, equal autonomy. And then thirdly, solidarity. Well, this is a heated debate for the moment. I think, in fact, that freedom and equality cannot be doubted. The whole law system depends on these two norms in every democracy in the world. The question is solidarity. What's the role of solidarity? And some say, well, there are church groups or groups linked to churches, and they should realize a solidary social system. They should help those who are in trouble. My personal view is that a well-developed democracy has to include this third norm or value. And this is not bound exclusively to a certain type of political praxis or political parties even. Also conservative politicians, Christian democratic politicians accept this as the third value, not only social democratic movements. The idea is the following. In ancient times and medieval times, solidarity is practiced, so to say, face by face. You see somebody falling and you help. You see somebody who doesn't have enough food and you give him food. The modern idea is that there are basic social rights. You have social rights as citizen. Rights. And that if you have fallen, metaphorically, then you have a right that you are helped. And this right is established lawfully. So there's a lawful system that organizes solidarity within society. And my personal point of view is that without this organized social solidarity, there is no loyalty or no sufficient loyalty regarding the democratic system. In the German history, it was Bismarck who realized this very early, that loyalty to the state depends on organized solidarity. This was not a democracy, but he was very successful in this. Many dictators found that loyalty can only be expected if there is organized solidarity. I would say democracy should be intelligent enough to realize this insight. Without organized solidarity, democracies are unstable. And if the economic development is in difficulties, very often the democratic system is in danger. And therefore, it is advisable to take this first norm or first value as the third value as part of the normative basis of the normative constituents of democracy. So we have three. I skip now these parts and try to explain a bit why this leads to an understanding of democracy as cooperation. There is a widespread opinion which takes the state on the one hand and the society on the other. Some even formulate it like this: there is civil society on the one hand, and there are the state institutions on the other. I think this is true in many cases, in many political systems, but it is not true in democracy. A strong, dynamic democracy depends on close relations between state institutions and civil society. A democracy without civil society can't work. And a civil society in democracy is fostered and backed up by political institutions. So there is not a mere opposition between civil life and citizens' engagement and so on and so forth on the one hand, and state institutions on the other. A democracy depends on the fact that civil engagement and political engagement are two sides of the same coin. You say this in English? I don't know. In German you say this. Yeah? So depending on each other. And what is civil society? Civil society is a form of cooperating even beyond your family ties, your most personal ties. Citizenship can be understood as an extended form of social cooperation that is, in all societies, realized in the tiny dimension of families and partnerships and so on and so forth. Yeah? Marriage between the generations and so on and so forth. So citizenship is the idea to extend this form of cooperation beyond the family ties. Yeah? And this beyond the family ties is quite essential, not only for the stability of the democratic system, but also, as an American scientist has shown convincingly, Robert Putnam, for the economic success. He showed it originally analyzing the Italian situation, and the South economically is very much weaker than the North, and well, there are different explanations for this. But what he found out is that cooperation beyond the family is not realized in south of Italy. This has reasons in the history. For hundreds and hundreds of years, there were foreigners who ruled the southern part of Italy. Whereas in the northern parts of Italy, there is more city tradition, regional self-government tradition, and so on and so forth. So there is a culture of trust. Trust also those who are not member of your family. Whereas the idea in Sicily, and I know the Sicilian situation quite well, was that you should only trust members of your own family. Only trust members of your own family. Never somebody outside. Keep your mouth shut if you talk to somebody outside your own family. So this is a culture of distrust. And this impedes also economic success, and it endangers the democratic system. So I understand democracy as an institutionalized form of fostering and helping, sometimes even initiating, cooperation. Democracy as a state system, as a political system, depends on the existence of civil society and social engagement, civil engagement. And in democracies, civil cooperation is fostered by state action and state institutions. So these two elements are interdependent in democracies, not in dictatorships in general. So now let's put the different arguments together. We come to a cultural, it leads to a cultural basis of democracy as cooperation. The cultural prerequisites of democracy as cooperation. Equal respect, equality and freedom is a cultural prerequisite of democracy, as we have seen. If citizens' engagement is a basis of democracy, then the citizens' opinions are important for democratic decision-making. It cannot be the case that it's just dependent on experts, how the government decides. Once elected, experts decide. In a true democracy, in a real democracy, it's the public opinion that is relevant, and a well-informed public opinion. This is a problem of popularization of political issues. You can easily get citizens to applaud if you make it very simple. But then very often the wrong decision is taken on this basis. So you have to have a public discourse, a well-informed public discourse. And the media play a certain role in this. Newspapers, and so on. Without trustfulness, without trust and reliability, communication is not possible. Though a culture of trust is a prerequisite of democracy, not of dictatorships. There you don't need trust as a cultural basis. But in democracies you need it. There is no democracy without public discourse. And there is no public discourse without a culture of trust. There is no democracy without a common sense of justice. Maybe the most important political philosopher of the second half of the 20th century, John Rawls, in the meantime dead some years ago, has exclusively concentrated all of his work on the question of political justice. And one of his results is that accepting all the differences in ethnicity, in forms of life, in traditions, values, and so on and so forth. A liberal, democratic society is dependent on a common sense of justice. He uses the term of an overlapping consensus. So there are different groups in society who partly base their form of life on a comprehensive doctrine, for example, religious doctrine or other doctrines. Yeah. But still, even if these comprehensive doctrines are not compatible with each other, they are incompatible, there must be a region of overlapping norms and values. And these overlapping part of values and norms must be such that democracy is possible. In other words, must be based on equal respect and solidarity. A common sense of justice, shortly, is necessary, is a cultural requirement, normative and cultural requirement of democracy. And if I'm right, democracy can only work if there is a common public discourse on questions of justice, of political justice, in the broader sense. Individual rights form a part of justice in general. There is no incompatibility or tension between liberty and justice or something like that. An adequate respect for individual liberty is part of justice. In case of John Rawls, maximal individual liberties is the first principle of justice. So liberty and justice is not, doesn't hint in different directions. In a deliberative democracy, there is a public discourse on questions of political justice. What is right and wrong? In present times, globalization changes not only the economic conditions, but also the political conditions. And this is a common challenge, it seems to me, in almost every country in the world. Because globalization changes the role and relevance of the nation state. And till present times, the nation state has been organized, democracy has been organized exclusively in nation states. There is no international democracy till now. And even the European example that we might discuss later on, if you like to, is not really a democracy. So till now, democracies are organized within the nation state, Now globalization changes the political conditions of the nation state. For example, this globalization has an impact on how we deal with the tension between work, labor on the one hand and capital on the other. During the decades after the Second World War, almost every democracy in the world has developed instruments to find a compromise between the interests of the capital on the one hand and the working people on the other. This compromise in the meantime is challenged, because if capital moves there where the conditions are best, then it is very difficult for a government in a democratic state to keep up with these results of this compromise, because then the conditions for capital and investment may be less advantageous in their own country than in some other countries in the world. This is, in fact, a challenge especially important for old Europe, for the social welfare states in northern and middle Europe, so Scandinavian countries, Germany, and so on. And we face presently an erosion of the financial basis of social state democracies for this reason. And if there is a highly developed mobility of firms in the world, then the positive correlation of economic success on the one hand and social welfare on the other can be threatened. It can, for example, be the case that a firm that has high returns, for exactly this reason, can afford to change the state in which the firm is active. This happened during the last decade several times in Germany. So especially those firms go away who are extremely successful. So this is a new situation, because you could tell the people, well, if your firm is successful, it's also an advantage for you. You have your work, you don't lose it. The state has tax revenues and can finance social welfare and so on and so forth. So the system is interrelated. So the success of the firm is the success of the people, the success of the state. But this is threatened in the process of globalization. Now, I have brought some empirical data with me. We can discuss it later. I don't have the time now to present them. It's not necessary for the argument. I would say we have to find a political strategy that keeps up with this development. That means that stays with the principles of democracy on the one hand, stays with the idea of equal respect, equal autonomy, equal liberty, organized also by democratic states that look for the requirements of such personal and individual lives. And on the other hand, accepting that the economic situation has changed such that the nation state is not anymore in control, or only partly in control, of the economic system. This exactly is what makes the European project interesting. It may be the only serious project to establishing an institutional order beyond the nation state, including the nation states. End of this year, 27 nation states, giving up part of sovereignty to European institutions, and in this way changed the relation between economy and political system. I give you a figure. Germany's economy is very much oriented towards export and import. Between 30 and 40% of the national product is export-import in Germany. If you take the European community as a whole, it's only between 6 and 8%. This is almost equal, a little bit more, than it is the case with the United States. And this is the reason that the United States policy is more independent from global developments and can even establish policies that would lead to a disaster in a usual nation state, because the economy is big enough and the dependency on the global economy is comparatively small. The same is true for the European community as a whole. It's not true for Germany, it's not true for Sweden, it's not true for Great Britain, but it's true for the European community as a whole. In fact, a common policy strategy is not well developed till now within the European community, but this is the goal, and the first steps are taken. We can discuss whether it can be successful or not. I hope that it will be successful. This leads us to the last part of what I wanted to present, the future prospects. I think the future prospects of democracy depend on this, that we understand democracy not only organized within one nation state with one level of government, but a multi-level democracy that gives responsibility, for example, to the cities, to the counties, to the regions, to the nation state, to those newly established state or institutional systems beyond the nation state, like the European community. And I think if you think this through, there is no alternative to establish an international lawful order. Step by step. This will take a while till this is developed. And if this is developed in an adequate way, we would have a democracy based still on the little structures that we are acquainted with, cities, nation states, but also on the continents of bigger communities of different nation states, and then a minimal state world order, a lawful international system that, for example, makes sure that certain social standards and ecological standards are met worldwide, and that the future of humankind in the world is not threatened by destroying, for example, the environment and worsening the situation for future generations to live. So we need a basic normative consensus on these questions on the global level. And this is the beginning of a global civil society. And it's the idea which changes the world. The idea of a global civil society is the idea of a global democracy. Thank you very much.
「亲爱的好朋友，我想让大家知道一下，今天甚至于有人特别从香港飞过来，就为了听这个演讲，而且来表达支持我们基金会在台湾所做的努力。那我其实想要请我们台湾的朋友给苏永安董事长特别的掌声，好不好？谢谢苏董事长。 那同时，刚刚诺姆林教授有谈到 civil society， 那我想这个 civil society 大概我们基金会可以是一个非常小但是相当好的代表。就是今天的所有的工作，除了是联发科它对于台湾这个社会的贡献之外，我们只有4个工作人员。那同时基金会所有的董事，包括本董事长，我们全部是志工。那今天所有的工作都是由大概是40位志工，其中还有从香港特别飞来做2天志工的朋友们所推出来的成果。我们感谢一下所有的志工，好吗？那讲到这里的话，意思也就是说，如果要让我们的公民社会得到更成熟的提升，基金会欢迎你们，不管是做志工或者是捐款，随时都等候着你们加入。Julian, I was just telling the audience that we even have guests flown in from Hong Kong to join us here today. So that was wonderful. Is it okay I address you as Julian? Yeah, okay. In order for you to understand very accurately my question, so I will deliver my question in English. 那所以大家我们大家就试试看吧，反正英文跟中文就是混着走，好不好？谁走谁说啊。I was trying to explain to you before you started that you are actually speaking to an audience today who is very much troubled at heart. At one point, the Taiwanese know very well that they have come a long way achieving the democratic state that they have achieved so far. And it's a vibrant democracy, it's a working democracy, and yet we have been experiencing a lot of problems. And many of us are also very puzzled with this system called democracy. In your talk just now, you mentioned some very essential elements of democracy. So the election process, the process of voting itself, does not make democracy. And you mentioned for democracy to work, you need a common sense of justice. You mentioned you need an informed public opinion. You need a culture of trust. And you mentioned you need a civil society supported by and interacting with the political institution. So what I would say about what we are experiencing now in Taiwan is, yes, we have an electoral system, which brings a lot of trouble. And we have a sense of justice, yes, but we don't have a common sense of justice. We have a very powerful public opinion, but we lack an informed public. And we have trust for each other, or we have trust for our own groups, but I don't think we have formed a culture of trust, you mentioned. And then we have a very strong civil society in comparison to other parts of Greater China, in comparison with Hong Kong or Macau or even of China. Taiwan is probably the best in terms of civil society, but our civil society vis-a-vis the political institutions, again, there's a gap there. Okay, so there's tension and gap there. My question to you is, how do you reach that consensus when we are in this state of rather serious split in terms of justice and values? How does one reach that consensus?
I have already been asked by newspapers about advices to give to the Taiwanese public or to Taiwanese political developments, and you may understand my position in general that I'm not competent to do this. I can judge part of the European societies, my own maybe best, but it's very difficult to give advices from the outside. 1 week now in this country, I have read a little bit of English-speaking newspapers that you can read here about from Taiwan, but this is not enough to judge. So I can only answer in more abstract terms regarding experiences one has in other regions of the world, and one
or Germany. Yeah.
Germany, yeah. Let's take Germany. Yeah, Germany is a late democracy. Late democracy regarding France, Denmark, and Great Britain, especially, or the United States. And in Germany, the democracy was established first time 1918-19 against the will of the leading cultural class, let's say, to put it in Marxist terms, in Germany. It was more or less the soldiers and others who established the democracy. And so from the beginning, this, in fact, was not based on a culture of trust. And it ended 12 years later in the dictatorship of Hitler. And after the Second World War, the re-establishment of democracy was an import, was not a result of it was not an own success of the citizens, of the German citizens. It was an American and Western import. And there are polls showing that till midst of 60s, a high percentage of the German population said, well, it's better if you have a strong man who governs. Starke Mann. Maybe within democracy, Adenauer was maybe such a simple democratic politician, but a strong man who decided for decades what happened. So there was a longing, in a way, there was still a longing for a not democratically organized political system. And it ended end of the 60s, the cultural revolution, so to say, the cultural revolt of the young, that said, well, we have now to think again about the normative basis of democracy. For example, how do we treat the history of the National Socialist time? So Taiwan is a young democracy, even younger, much younger than Germany. And probably the time is too short to expect that these essential elements that I developed in this speech, and you mentioned them again, can evolve adequately within such a short time, especially if there are two very different strategic approaches to politics. If I judge rightly, unusually different, unusually in basic questions of the identity of the nation state, there is not a consensus as far as I can see. However, maybe the term nation state is wrong, but the political, let's say the identity of the political communities of the Taiwanese people, this question is answered, it seems to me, quite differently. And this is unusual for democracy, because usually you have a basic consensus in these questions, not in many other questions, but in these questions of the identity of the political community, there is usually a consensus. And this is certainly a challenge, how to get to a situation in which such a consensus may evolve. I can't judge this. This is up to you to judge and maybe to engage.
Well, you actually mentioned that the desire for a strong man when a large amount of people in a certain society feels very nervous and uneasy about the chaos in society. As a matter of fact, that even in Taiwan today, there is a part of the opinion which says, look at Singapore with the strong man, Mr. Lee, and the society works better than us, that we are always arguing and fighting against one another. Now coming back to, you just mentioned a little while ago, you mentioned that, well, the voting action itself is actually the minimum of what democracy means. It's essential to judge a democracy depending on the question whether you have equal autonomy, you have equal chances of equal share in the decision-making process, so on and so forth. So what if, let's say, we get a Li Guangyu, Mr. Li, for Taiwan, okay? And this strong man, he can guarantee you equal autonomy, equal chances, equal everything. Would you prefer that? Would you say that's okay?
Well, the problem is that you can never guarantee that it remains like this. And the charming aspect of democracy is that if it turns out that the development is not as citizens expected, you can vote and you can change the government without civil war. So even if democracy is not identical with voting systems and the collective decision procedures, but is much more, as I tried to develop, without this possibility to change governments without civil war, democracy can't work. So there is dependency from each other. Certainly, even in democratic systems, take the French system, this may be an example, that especially if there are deep conflicts, people hope that there is a unifying political office like the presidency that is almost unchallenged. So the French president decides on who is minister president and decides who is in government, and he can even veto lots of legislation. So stronger than the US president institutionally seen. And this is an element of combining advantages of feudalism yeah, with a democratic system. But still there are dangers, and the German experience was never allow this again, not even a strong democratic president directly elected by the people. Make sure that there is a representative system, make sure that the parliament decides, that there is no central figure, central personality that has everything in control, because this can easily be changed into one form or the other of dictatorship. Yeah.
If we're talking about a country actually lacking consensus, I always feel happy when I see how the United States is split today because of Bush. When I look at how the intellectuals fight against each other and they cannot come to a consensus, I thought to myself, well, if an old democracy like America could do so miserably, then we Taiwanese are okay. This question I'd like to hear from a philosopher, you, especially from a German-speaking philosopher. I remember Karl Popper said in 1954, Karl Popper 是哲学家. Karl Popper in 1954, when he was observing the very young democracy of Germany, of Europe, he said something that struck me very much. He said, it is not at all enough to simply transplant a democratic system of voting and all that if in your traditional culture, in your traditional mindset, this liberal thinking and this tolerance and this respect for individual autonomy is not in your traditional culture, is not in your roots, then simply having this democratic system, it's not going to work. And this is what he said about Germany in 1954. And now this is something like 50 years later. And looking at the development of democracy in an old democracy of the United States, how would you evaluate the democracy of Germany today, say 50 years after Karl Popper made that comment?
I commend both United States and Germany. Well, maybe Germany first. As far as one can see from asking citizens about their values, attitudes towards, for example, freedom and equality and democratic institutions and so on and so forth, it seems that Germany is now, quite recently, that this is the case, one of the most stable democracies, culturally, most stable democracies in the world. On the same level as France, for example. Yeah? Also in France there are tendencies of right-wing critiques of democracy, even the percentage is higher than in Germany presently. But France is a very stable democracy, and Germany is too, Great Britain in any case. But this has taken some decades to develop. And I would say for the moment, even economic problems like Germany faces presently and faced in the past does not challenge this attitude. There are some youngsters in Eastern German regions that tend to National Socialist ideologies, but it seems to me that this is not so much political, it's more a social problem. Yeah? There is a lack of perspective, personal perspective. There is not enough there are not enough jobs there, and so on and so forth. And if you ask these youngsters, mostly male young persons, they can't even tell what National Socialism is. So it's more a culture than a political movement. Yeah. But one can discuss this. This old democracy, United States, even some years older than France, in a way is, for me at least, not the role model of democracy, is not a role model of democracy. For the following reasons. In the United States, we have, from the beginning, a culture of distrust against national government. Distrust
for national government.
And the reason is that those who came to the United States came there because, not all, but many of them, because they were in opposition to the political situation or religious situation, also social situation in which they lived in Europe. And the idea of many, many immigrants was, now we live more or less without government. Yeah? And this has led to a culture of distrust against the federal state, as the Americans call it, the federal state on the national level, that, for example, has the result, among others, that mostly less than 50% elect the president. Less than 50% of the population elect the most important political office. Yeah.
What is the figure in Germany, the voters?
87 on national, 87%.
87, wow.
sometimes even above 90. Yeah. And so I would say this shows that something did not go well in the biggest Western democracy worldwide. This is the United States. And the other is the third value I mentioned. Yeah. The third value is about organized solidarity. And in contrary to all European democracies, in the United States, the attitude is not only widespread, but till now has led to a specific form of political strategy that did not organize solidarity within the democratic institutions itself. There is lots of solidarity, but organized outside. Churches, for example, neighbor groups, and so on and so forth. And if you live in an American city, you have lived in the United States, I lived for 1 year in the United States, you find it astonishing, to be polite, that the richest country in the world has this amount of poverty in the cities, and that you can't go out during night times in certain quarters of the cities because the social tension is too big, and this is the richest country in the world. So this is the reason why I do not take the United States as the role model of democracy.
I hope that solidarity is not translated into 团结 in English, in Chinese. I think what Julian meant is not 团结。应该被解释，应该被翻译作，有没有更好的翻译？他讲的 solidarity， 我觉得应该翻译作就是说社会网络对于弱势的照顾，所以不是跟团结没有关系啊，对不起。Coming from this, your position in 2001 as the first national cultural minister of Germany, I found this fascinating, because before you, the last cultural ministry was called propaganda ministry during the Nazi time. And the Germans, because of their very special past, so they were acutely and painfully sensitive about anything that is national. But Schroeder was courageous enough to create this ministry in the year 2001. And I remember when this position was created, the cultural minister of Bavaria, Zietmer, he said, well, Germany needs a national ministry of affairs. It's like Austria needs a navy. In Chinese 就是 Austria， 奥地利是根本没有不靠海的一个国家，所以当时的巴伐利亚的文化邦的文化部长是说，德国这个国家为什么会需要一个文化部长？就譬如是奥地利还需要海军一样，是绝对反对有国家级、中央级的文化部长的。And then you became Minister of Culture at that time. And also at that time you said, actually to have a national cultural policy was an important central responsibility of democratic society. Would you explain a little bit on this?
You have to know that in the German political system established immediately 4 years after the end of Second World War, there was this fear that again, from a democratic system, there could evolve a new dictatorship, new right-wing, whatever, political system, because Hitler came to power more or less, not 100%, but more or less within the rules of the democratic system. Yeah. So one tried to avoid everything which could lead again in this direction. This is the reason that the president, for example, Bundespräsident, German president, is so weak, maybe the weakest in the world. The Austrian Bundespräsident has a similar role, but is much stronger, as can decide much more. The German president can sign the legislation and represent the state outside. And give speeches, but not decide politically. And the other was that the other step taken was that in general the counties, Länder, were in charge of everything that is not explicitly mentioned as a task of the national level. So if you read the German constitution, you get the impression this is a mixture of intergovernmental system and nation-state system. Yeah, it's more intergovernmental if you read the constitution than nation-state. But in the course of the decades after the Second World War, the system changed, even if there were only minor changes written down in the constitution. Politically, the national level became stronger and stronger, and for good reasons, I think. Yeah. For example, these counties are very, very different in size. There are tiny counties with 500,000 of inhabitants, like Bremen, big ones like 17 million of inhabitants, like North Rhine-Westphalia, Bavaria, 12 millions, and then are very poor ones and rich ones, and so on and so forth. So this is disbalanced, so disbalanced that you cannot base a state on such a system. And this is one of the reasons that the national level became stronger and stronger, but some exceptions. And one exception used to be culture, education, school, and so on. And it is still the case that the major responsibility is for fostering cultural projects is at the cities. Depending how you count those cities who are counties themselves, like Berlin, Hamburg, Bremen. If you take these as being cities, then it's almost 60% of the whole cultural fostering that is decided on by the cities and the city-states. And then 30% counties, and then 12% on the national level. The reason why Schröder established a cultural minister was twofold. One reason is to give to make clear that the cultural development is of national importance, and that there is somebody in the national government whom you can address if there are problems in the cultural development in Germany, not only in one city or one county. And the second was that, in fact, on the national level, take, for example, the foreign cultural policy of Germany worldwide, but also take all, as an example, take all the legislation that is culturally relevant. Yeah, I'm not talking of fostering projects, just legislation that is culturally relevant. For example, if you think about the copyright law is highly relevant for the situation of artists in every field. So this is something the national level decides on, not the Länder. Now, if there is not even one minister competent in cultural questions, this can raise some problems. So, twofold reason. Yeah? A symbolic act, if you might call it a symbolic act on the one hand, but important symbolic act, I would say. And the other is, as I have called it, a good part of cultural politics is legislation. In German, I called it Ordnungspolitik. Yeah. I don't know how to translate it into English and in Chinese. So to establish a lawful order that is advantageous for the artists and the cultural development of the country.
Do you consider yourself a leftist or a rightist?
Yeah,
this is a tough question. But this is,
yeah.
I ask this question as half a joke because it's a stupid question. How can you do that? Just put the hat on your head. But seriously, underneath this question was, you were talking about freedom, autonomous freedom, being a true element of democracy. And at the same time, you talk about equality as an essential part of it. However, we know that between freedom and equality, there is very, very serious conflict between these two concepts, which oftentimes kind of divides whether you are left or right. So how do you respond to this?
In this case, I would say, no, you are wrong. As I understand freedom and equality, and I try to develop it in philosophical terms, they are interlinked. And if you call it a leftist position, that's one says, well, equality is important, then okay, then I am a leftist. But the central idea is, if you take liberty seriously, it is not just liberty of the few, it is liberty of the many. You see? So those who say, well, liberty or freedom is the first value of democracy, I can say, okay, okay. But do you mean liberty of the few or liberty of all? You see? And if, for example, somebody says, well, liberty means market, and that's all, as many do, then I would say, well, the market tends to exclude those who cannot produce goods that one can buy on the market. The disabled, for example, the elderly, and so on. The market tends to exclude all those who are not advantageous for the market system. And so if you take liberty seriously, you have to look for certain policies, institutions, and so on and so forth, who make sure that nobody is excluded and everybody can live his or her own life. So if my position would be, if you take liberty seriously, you have to include equality, because it's equal liberty. Everybody has the right to live his own life, not only a few. Yes. You see? But I will answer this question about leftist or not. I would say, if you allow, to characterize my own position. First, social democratic, in the sense that I take the third value I mentioned, solidarity, as constitutive for democracy. Not just some addendum, something you can do or you can leave, yeah? But something that is constitutive for democracy. So in that sense, social democracy. Democracy has also a social aspect. In this more abstract sense, a social democrat. Second, I'm a Republican. Maybe not in the sense of George W. Bush, but in another sense.
Republican? In what sense? American sense?
No, I just explained it. I'm a Republican. Republican comes from res publica. It's Latin. And that means the public things, the things that are up to the citizens and not just up to the private person, up to the citizens, are important. So a Republican says, well, get engaged into these questions in res publicae, in the Latin sense. Here, if I understand this foundation rightly, it's a Republican movement. What else? It's about public questions, public goods, and so on and so forth. And we have a tendency to pry privatize, you say in English? To privatize more and more. Yeah? To get involved in, I don't know, going to the movies, that's okay. Sitting at home and look in the internet, that's okay. Meeting a friend, that's okay. All this is okay. But if you then are not a citizen anymore, but only a private person interested in consuming and producing or whatever, then there's something missing that is quite relevant for the democratic development. So Republican, and thirdly, you asked me, so I answer. Thirdly, centrist. Centrist. I explain what I mean by it. I think there's always a threat in every democratic society that the extremes, because they are more radical, more uncompromising, seeming more decided, and so on and so forth. So they gain supporters. Yes? And there was a time in my life when most of my friends were far left, Marxists, neo-Marxists. So what is vote? This was part of the culture, so to say. And they called me a liberal because I defended the democratic system, the lawful state, and so on and so forth, against these Marxist movements. In the meantime, most of them are far right of my position. They say, well, there's only the market order, and no solidarity necessary, no social state necessary, and so on and so forth. So you see, it's centrist. When all go left, I say, well, be careful. If all go right, I say, be careful. So you have to have some proportion in the society that is balancing out the extremes. Otherwise, democracy is in danger.
Here's my very last question before I open up the floor. That is, as a social democrat, would you say yes to the challenge from other European nations, which says to the Germans, your Autobahn, your highways are too dangerous because you don't have speed limit. So please have speed limit. Do you say yes or no?
Yeah. The motive behind it might be a little different. The motive behind this saying for the moment, at least partly, is the dominance of German cars in the European market, and they mostly have strong machines, and so the hope is that if you have also speed limits, say of 100 kilometers an hour, nobody produces Mercedes, BMW and Porsche anymore, and so it would be easier to compete on the European and global market. But put this aside, I think for reasons of environment and of reasons of security, some speed limit would be a good idea. Not just 100 kilometers an hour, 140 I would say.
Oh, so you agree to reduce it to something like 140. Yeah, 300 is out. It's no good for you. Okay, thank you so much. Julian, now you probably have to use this. I'm going to give the floor to our audience here. I wonder, because the people who are sitting next room, 音频在另外的房间现在开始发问了，他们可以进来吗？那就可以直接提问。哦，是从那边来的提问单，是不是？哦，好的。亲爱的好朋友，我们这样子好不好？就是说，我们用口头提问以及这个书面的提问交叉，一个口头提问，一个是书面的提问啊。那么，我们有一个共同的游戏规则，就是说，其实真的很难得。这样的一个哲学家，我觉得他很有欧陆的性格的哲学家，可以到这里来跟我们分享他的一些想法。那是不是当您提问或者是自己有看法想要说的时候，是用最精简的语言把你的意思说出来，以便于给大家都有机会 表达自己的意思或者提出自己的问题，就是自己的问题，我们大家自我克制一下，限制在2分钟之内，好不好？2分钟之内的问题。那 and Julian, in order to that you receive more questions, you probably also control your time in your answering so that we get more questions. Please read together. Yeah, it's good. Okay. 哪一位是第一位？请举手。我们接受3个问题，然后再同时也请您很简短的告诉我们一下您是谁，好不好 ？Please， 请。
Thank you, Doctor. My name is Guo Gongyi. I'm from Kaohsiung, and I'm a medical doctor. My question is, the transform of a society from a less democratic state into a more mature democracy definitely involves learning process. And my question is related with the social transforming process in Germany after the reunion from the former separated states. In the beginning, there must be a great uneven in social status and tremendous discrepancy in political beliefs. How did the political leaders and the citizens work together, and what was the German experience in the learning and the reforming process so that a stable democratic state today was gradually formed? Thank you.
We'll get 3 or yeah. 谢谢您，请坐啊。第2个问题，哪一位？在楼上有，请。
你好，我姓宋，在台湾大学工作。I have a question about globalization. In your speech, you mentioned about globalization very important. Was very important influence in Europe and in the whole world, and it also have important influence on democracy. So I have another question about localization. When people mention globalization, also a lot of people mention localization is also very important response and to globalization. So what kind of localizations force happen in Europe, and any examples can help us to what kind of response about localization happen in Europe, and or localization have any influence on democracy? Thank you.
I think the third one I'll take a written one. Okay， 这边有一个问题是，请问欧盟未来有没有可能跨区投票？这个意思大概是说，一个希腊人跑到德国来投票啊。之前法国的公投的 Constitution 没有通过，是为什么？那个 EU 就是欧盟将来的发展，你看见它的最大的困难会是什么？
Yeah, thank you very much for these 3 very important questions. First, the German example, learning process, unification. But it's partly also a bitter example, I would say. I have to answer shortly. So it's difficult to describe it in only 2 phrases. The process who led to unification was not initiated by West Germany. It was initiated within Eastern Germany. The society there did not accept the government anymore. They were in charge and they were successful, not Western Germany, even if some have forgotten it in the meantime. And they expected not so much the unification originally, the people in the east of Germany. They expected democracy. They even expected socialism with a human face, as they called it. And what then happened was very bitter for many of the persons in the West and in the East. The persons politically in charge thought that there is no time left. We cannot give this process the chance to develop smoothly. Let's say within 5 or 10 or 15 or maybe even 20 years. They thought they should decide from one day more or less to the next. Unification of Germany. So 2 states became 1 state. Not only this, they got 1 currency only. And this resulted in an almost total destruction of the industrial base in Eastern Germany. If we had unified Portugal and Germany, the result would have been the same. The industrial base of Portugal wouldn't survive because it's not competitive on the Western German market, or Greece, or so. And what happened then next is that whereas before the women and men equally were included in the workforce, equally, more or less equally. Over 90% of women worked in former GDR, in the former communist part of Germany. Mostly women lost their jobs, also very many men. So we have in the official data about 20% unemployment rate in the Eastern German countries. In fact, it is at least double as much, so we have 40% of roughly unemployed persons, mostly women, not content with this situation. Even worse, the productivity rate that is very essential for the economic situation raised in the beginning of this process during the 91 years, 91, 92, 93, 94. But since then, the gap between the productivity in the west of Germany and the east of Germany raised again. So in the meantime, we have round about 50% productivity only in Eastern Germany regarding the Western German productivity rate. And this results in a transfer of money which is about 5% of the national product of Germany. That seems maybe not much, but it is extremely high transfer rate. It's higher than in every other known country in the world. It's, for example, much higher than the transfer rate in Italy from the north to the south. Much, much higher. And this weakened the German economy as a whole. And culturally, it led to a situation that most citizens in the East are happy that we have a democracy in the meantime. But also most persons in Eastern Germany are unhappy with the situation that they had to accept everything coming from Western Germany, including the wrecked school system. Now we changed the school system, partly in the direction as it was in Eastern Germany before. So this is not a role model, to put it shortly. Almost everything went wrong except the state unification. The unification of the German state went well. All the rest went quite wrong. So I would not advise to follow this example if you have similar plans. Take time, yeah? Take your time. When Saarland was integrated, Saarland was formerly after Second World War, tiny county, 1 million roughly inhabitants, was part of France. And after a decision of the population in the 50s, it came to Germany. And there were 5 years at the beginning and then again 5 years to give them time to integrate the economy. So this German example in this respect is not a good example, nor in the economic and neither in the cultural sphere. The second question about localization, maybe I didn't understand the question fully. You mean counter globalization movements or something like that, or strategies, political strategies directed against globalization? Is this the question? If this is the question,
sorry, maybe I have to make my question more clear. A lot of people think globalization is a very important force happening, but now a lot of people think during this process, a lot of people think a place needs a very long time to absorb the meaning or absorb the function, absorb the stress of the globalization. And some people also think about some people don't like the globalization, so I think localization contains a lot of meaning. So what kind of localizations happens more seriously in Europe, or how Europe people think about localization?
Yeah. Okay. Well, there are different forms of opposition against the globalizing economy, but on the other hand, there is the policy of the European community. There is the participation of European countries, including Germany, in the GATS process, so in this international process of free trade development. So I do not think that the anti-globalization movement is a success in general. What is important is the question how much of the nation-state specific political traditions can survive. And there's one promising example. This is the Scandinavian example. Sweden has a social welfare state, the highest developed social welfare state in the world, and somehow they managed it to make this system competitive. So there is no problem anymore. Sweden has one of the highest productivity rates in the world, and the Swedish people pay extremely high rates of taxations, pay taxes, extremely high rates, and nevertheless it seems that there is no problem with capital investment in the Swedish economy, and Finland, Denmark is the same. One reason for this is that the financiation of the social welfare state in Sweden is based exclusively on taxes, whereas it is based in Germany and in France on contributions that every employee pays, and the employer pays too, half and half originally, now it changed, more employee than employer, and this makes labor expensive. Yeah, and this contributes to the unemployment rates. So this is maybe one of the reasons why the social welfare state in the Scandinavian countries seems to survive. But it was one reason that there were reluctance within the Scandinavian countries to get integrated into the European community, and why there the nation-state orientation is still very strong. So this is a form of opposition to globalization that may prove successful in the long run.
About globalization, apparently the European attitude about globalization is rather different from the Asians.
Yeah.
If we come down from the high-floating abstract ideas about this and come down to earth, for example, Taiwan has a concentration of an institution called 7-Elevens, 24-hour 7-Elevens. I think Taiwan is the one with the highest density of 7-Eleven shops, which replaces the mom-and-pop shops, the traditional shops owned by Mr. So-and-so. We also tend to easily embrace Starbucks and Kentucky Fried Chickens and all that. But by contrast, the Europeans are much more careful and resistant about things like this. So, well, it is my observation that the Europeans are more conservative or more cautious about embracing whatever is coming with the flow of globalization. But allow me to remind both our audience and Julian, because we do like to take in more questions. So when the questions are so big about Europe as a whole, because there are so many differences between Britain, France, and Italy. So may I ask that we try to focus the questions kind of with smaller focus, and Julian watches the time so that we take more questions in. And there's still the third one about the EU.
Well, this is also a question that makes it necessary that I give another speech. Yeah? But shortly, indeed, France, the French decision of the French population against the constitution, European constitution, meant that this process stopped. To be more concrete, this process meant to develop more of a political union and not only of an economic union on the European level. And this, for the moment, this development has come to an end. It is a crisis. I think it is a crisis. Some say, well, it's business as usual. Europe is as it was before. I think it is a crisis that can be overcome. And the possibilities to overcome lay especially there in the democratization of the European level. So there's the European Parliament, for example, is not a legislative parliament. They're only in the world. Yeah? So usually parliaments legislate. That's their job. European Parliament doesn't do this. The legislation is up to the governments or the ministers forming the European Council, and this is a very unusual structure because the executive power then is in the European context is a legislative power. This is also not the idea of democracy. So I think this is the way how to overcome the crisis we have for the moment, to develop a political, democratic structure of the European Union and not to rely exclusively on the economic integration.
I'll insert this, I'll say this in Chinese. Do you want the earphone? OK， 关于欧盟，我在去年11月在华盛顿有一个会议，那这个会议里头，上一任的德国外交部长 Joschka Fischer， 我们在同一个 panel 里头，他谈了一件事情，讲到欧盟，就是说欧洲人对于土耳其加入欧盟，大多数的人民是强烈反对的，因为他们觉得土耳其作为伊斯兰教、穆斯林跟欧盟的基督教这两种价值，怎么可能变成一个欧盟？但是那天那个费雪外长，他说的是，他说，就欧洲的领导人的眼光来看，土耳其一定要进入欧盟。然后他分析那个原因是，他分析说，21世纪最危险的地区、最有爆炸性的地区，一定是伊朗这个国家以及它的周边。那土耳其是欧盟跟伊朗这个爆炸区之间的一个很重要的一个防火墙。如果你不把土耳其吸收进入欧盟，就等于是把土耳其就让给对方，那将来欧盟的危险性会非常非常的大。所以他的费雪在那个场合是说，其实完全是从大战略的角度去思考的话，这个土耳其一定要进来。那一般的老百姓是从文化的价值去看的话， 会不赞成土耳其进来。所以我有这么一个很有趣的经验，听到关于欧盟的这个说法。这是 just a side, just on the side, for your reference. But this next one, 这边下面我先念一个书面的，然后我们接着2个提问。下面这一个呢，我要翻译了。Professor Niđạt Nommen Lin, freue mich, Sie wieder zu sehen. Ich bin eine Studentin von Ihnen seit etwa 1993 aus. Ich studierte in Göttingen. Muss aber leider gehen. Wünsche Ihnen alles Gute, bis bald. Meine Frage ist SPD allmählich zu Recht entwickelt? Was ist Ihr Prospekt zu dieser politischen Tendenz? Was ist die Situation der Linken in der BRD? 陈教授还在吗？还是得走了，是不是 ？OK， 好，翻译。就是这位台湾大学法律系的陈教授，他曾经是诺姆林的学生，在哥廷根大学的学生所以很久不见了。他的问题是说，这个德国的社民党、社会民主党是不是变得越来越往右走，太右了？那么就说德国的左派到底怎么了？他现在在什么处境？往哪里走 ？OK。是不是有英文有翻译吧？没有吗？刚刚有没有英文 ？Is there English translation of this? Yeah. Okay. One more questions. 哪一位？我们等一下啊，就是哇，太多了。有一位最远的那一位，然后是中间这一位，好不好？来，那位小姐先，也请简短。
Dr. Yu Zheng and Dr. Long Tai, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. The question is whether Western Germany and Eastern Germany have cooperated to choose Democrats. Why mainland China refuse Democrats? Only Taiwan. Can you explain mainland China in the future will choose Democrats? Thank you.
这个我想诺姆林先生他不是中国事务专家，所以可能有一点为难我们的客人，要他回答中国将来要不要民主的问题。不过我看他自己怎么接这个招好了哈。刚刚在下的这位邵先生好。
Professor Rumanen, my name is Shao Yuming from Chinese Culture University. I think the problem for Taiwan is this. The population is divided by 70% of its inhabitants come from one particular province of China out of 35 in earlier days. The rest, 30%, came from every part of China. So this is ethnically divided. In your presentation, you mentioned some ethnicities constitute majority. Some constitute a minority. That's the hard reality of Taiwan today. In the United States, so-called WASP, the Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, white, constitute about 70%, and minorities constitute about 30%. In view of the fact, for these two societies, do you think your theories or ideas about democracy need some amendment or changes or corrections? Because years ago, when I exchanged a letter with Professor John Rouse of Harvard University about his book, A Theory of Justice, he said, my theory only applies to democratic countries, not to communist countries. So in view of that, and also in view of the ethnic situation in Taiwan and the United States, do you have any amendments or additional suggestions for these two societies, how to forge a more harmonious relationship between the minority and majority ethnic groups? Thank you.
So first, Turkey. You didn't ask a question, but I think I should comment on it. In In fact, it's one of the most difficult political issues I know, and one of the very few political issues I personally can't, for the moment, decide. And I give you the reasons. There are very good reasons for and against. I do not think that a good reason against including the Turkey into the European community is the Christian argument. Europe has big Muslim populations. In Germany, 3.3 million inhabitants are Muslim. In Great Britain, roughly the same. In France, more, 4.5, I think. There is at least one country, Bosnia and Herzegovina, that is Muslim country. This is not part of the European community for the moment, but one day will be part of the European community. So, and then those who say, well, this is a Christian society at large, overlook the fact that very many do not define themselves as Christian. Also in Eastern Germany, only a tiny minority calls itself Christian. The rest is agnostic, atheistic, whatever. So we should not define Europe by Christianity. This is not a counter-argument, but there are other arguments that have to be taken seriously. Turkey would be the biggest country, taken the population, in the European community. It would be a country that has at its borders many, many conflicts. It's in the midst of a very conflict region that is full of conflicts. It possibly would involve the European Union in two conflicts that the European Union for the moment not has, but would have then. If you combine a membership of Turkey with the usual rule that everybody can go to another membership state and live there and work there without any limitation, then we had the next problem, because the eastern parts of Turkey are extremely poor. And so there would a migration move of millions and millions, much more than we have for the moment from Eastern Europe. So there are problems. But there is a strong argument for the inclusion, and this is Turkey is the only bigger Islamic, has an Islamic society, Islamic population, Islamic state in the world that accepts the basic laws, rules, norms and values of democracy. Equality, gender equality, for example, the secularized state system, so the institutions are free of religious influence. It has a social state, even if not very well developed, but it is on a good way. It has a very strong economy, one of the highest growth rates in the world. So there are several reasons that speak in favor of the inclusion of Turkey, also because Turkey is the only member of the North Atlantic Treaty in this region. And NATO and European Union have something to do with each other. So let's stop here, but it is a very difficult question, but not easy to be answered. Second, the former student of mine, I remember very well, it was a doctoral thesis in philosophy of law, right? Is right? Right. And I would say partly yes and partly no. Partly yes. In fact, during the last Schröder years, some positions were given up that were essential for a social democratic movement. But for the moment, it seems that this party finds a new strategy in the long run. But you are right. As in the late 70s, beginning of the 80s, a good part of the leftist wing of the Social Democrats formed the Green Party. Likewise, the extension of the left socialist or post-communist party into the Western region would not have happened without these moves during the late Schröder government. For the moment, it's 8–9% of the population that is in favor of the post-communist party. And this is certainly also a sign that the Social Democrats gave up part of their spectrum. But I think for the moment there is a heated discussion about this long-term strategy. A new basic program, Grundsatzprogramm, is discussed. I'm also part of the commission that decides on it. So I think there will be some corrections regarding these last 3 years of the Schröder government. And then a question I didn't understand about China. May I skip this question? Also, linguistically, I didn't understand it. And then the last very important question, but I think one can answer it, about the problem of ethnic domination. My thesis was not that a country in which there is a group, an ethnic group that is bigger than any other or any coalition of others, cannot be a democracy. This is not my position. This is a position of the former Chancellor, German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, who has written a big article in the Zeit telling this and also mentioning Singapore and saying, look at Singapore. Singapore is in such a situation. But it is not a democracy. But my position is different. I think that even if there is an ethnic segregation, a certain ethnic segregation, and even if there is one ethnic group bigger than any coalition of others, democracy can be established, but under certain restrictions or conditions. And this condition is, for example, that the one ethnic group and the other ethnic groups are not separated politically. I gave the example that one bigger ethnic group has a party representing its interests, and the other has also a political party representing it, and both are in parliament, and the one has 60%, the other 40%. This is a situation unacceptable in a democratic system. So if it is such as you described in Taiwan and other places in the world, there is always a possibility to weaken this kind of collective identity and develop bridges between the groups, between the ethnic groups, forming maybe political parties who go beyond these ethnic groups, so are not exclusively concentrated on one of these ethnic groups, so that you have different kinds of collective identities. One kind is ethnic, the other may be political, a third one may be regional, a fourth one language or so. And then it is possible to have a stable democratic system, even if the situation is as you described.
Thank you. We have 2 people extra coming from the other room to come down here. Are they still here? The 2 people, can you raise your hands? The 2 of them? Only one? 就是说从上面的房间特别来的是哪2位？是你们2位吗？好的，那你们两位请问。
我的看法就是德国是不是比美国好？
This question in a nutshell is German democracy a better model than the American democracy? Okay, first question. 谢谢您啊，谢谢。好，第2位。
我自由写作，我的笔名叫康桥。我有个小问题，我看了一部电影，有关东德的电影叫《窃听风暴》，里面让我很感触很深，就是说为什么在那个年代，东德的人民只有1800万，但是却有600万人被建立了档案， 有30万人从事于县民或者是特务的工作。那这样子应该怪前苏联的占领者呢，还是应该怪德国人本身？
好，谢谢你。
还有第二个小问题问龙应台教授，就是那这一套为什么台湾在几十年前学得那么快，而且做得非常紧密？那现在是不是在公元2000年以后，这些特务系统是不是被民进党收编了？我一直不懂。谢谢。
好，谢谢您。The third one I'll read from here, Julian. 第三个问题 is from here. That's an interesting question. What kind of contribution or influence do you think a philosopher could make in a growing democratic system which is suffering from irrationality? Okay, good question. Good. 这个有这种。
Yeah, three partly difficult questions. The first is about, if I understood this rightly, about whether Germany is a model of democracy or not. Well, I would say Germany is, in one sense, it is a model, because it took about 15 years after Hitler's regime ended that the society became substantially democratic. 15, 20 years, depending how you count. So midst of 60s, I would say, Germany became a society that is democratic like other Western societies that had democracy for a much longer time, like France, for example. So in this sense, it's a very good development. In another sense, one can dispute it. I personally am in favor of this kind of federalism that begins with strong cities as counties, and then the national level. There are problems and tensions, but the interesting aspect of this federalist system of democracy is that you can extend it smoothly, so to say, to the continental level, European community, and in a way also to the global level. So if you have a multi-level democracy, it is more easily compatible with the extension of democracy beyond the nation state. But this is disputed. In France, you will not find many who have this view. Yeah. Okay, so the second, about the former GDR and the spies and how it comes that there were so many spies. Well, the problem of the former GDR was exactly this. It was not a nation state. It was part of Germany. And it had to make sure, from their point of view, that it didn't get lost. So the tension was politically, the tension between a communist regime in this part of Germany and the Western countries, Western democracies developing quite well. Everybody could listen to television stations coming from Western Germany. So this tension may be one of the reasons for this strange development in Eastern Germany. It's a good film. Those who haven't seen it, I would advise to see it. It's not an ideological piece of art that tells communism is bad and capitalism is good. It's a very sensitive and form of discussing the cultural problems of the former GDR and the unification. Second question, philosophy and the role of philosophy in politics and democracy, maybe especially. I would say if it is true that values and norms are quite essential for a democratic system, then the discussion of norms and values is essential for democracy. And within the context of discussing norms and values, philosophy has a certain part. Philosophy is no substitute for religion, neither for those who are religious nor for those who are agnostic. There are some philosophers and many citizens worldwide who expect philosophy to be a substitute of religion. So, for example, you are the philosopher, now tell us how to treat stem cell experiments on an ethical basis. I have my personal opinion, but as a citizen, not as a philosopher. It's very difficult to judge these problems. There is not the philosophical stance telling this is right and this is wrong. But philosophy, good philosophy, should be able to think clearly, to analyze concepts, to make sure that different criteria are coherent with each other. And in this role, philosophy can be of some help for the public discussion, also in such questions like genetic engineering and other questions where many have opinions who are not coherent. They are internally inconsistent. And there, philosophy can play a certain role to make this clear and also to strengthen the normative basis of democracy in discussing its norms and values and analyzing their role and their relation, their interrelation, as I tried it in this speech.
Julian, following this last question, I have this one for you, and I'll say that in Chinese. 刚刚的问题是说，在德国现在这个民主社会里头，作为一个哲学家，到底对这个民主社会有什么影响，在做什么？那我的问题是说，在我自己观察德国的13年之中，当我住在那里的13年之中，我自己的观察是，德国的知识分子，对于他的国家的政治的现实，第一是相当有高度的关切。第二，他们事实上是有非常强烈的互动 interaction， 也就是说，不管是诺贝尔文学奖得主Günter格拉斯，或者是我们比较熟悉的哈伯马斯，他们都会在德国这个国家，在价值混乱的时候。国家自己觉得有文化的危机或者政治的危机的时候，他们都会进行非常深入而且长期的大的辩论来影响社会。我自己目睹的几次，譬如说是柏林围墙倒塌的前后的大的辩论，对于德国的历史的大的辩论，对于海湾战争爆发的时候，德国到底该不该参战的这些大的辩论，知识分子是有相当大的这个一块的，在这个整个的国家的公共领域里头，也就是说，在德国传统里头，似乎是公共知识分子是占相当重要的一块。我想要请教您的是说，这一个德国的知识分子的公共知识分子的地位。跟譬如说在英国的传统以及法国的传统里头，是不是有任何的主要的不同？那紧接着就是说，那他这个德国的公共知识分子对于公共的这个影响以及互动，从过去到现在，又是不是有任何的重要的改变？它还重不重要？这也包括您自己作为一个哲学家。
Yeah, I think one has to differentiate between the different Western countries, Germany and other Western or European countries. As far as I can judge, for example, the role of intellectuals in the American United States political public sphere is quite irrelevant. They do not play a major role. There are some intellectuals who join certain political platforms, and then these platforms rely on their advisors, but there is almost no public discussion of philosophical theories in the United States. And I have some American colleagues, Martha Nussbaum, for example, whom I happen to know, and some others, who come to Berlin and give speeches and say, well, at least somebody is interested in what I'm talking about. Usually it's only my students and some colleagues in the university or so, and not the general public. So there is still a major difference between the United States on the one hand, also Germany, but there's also a difference in the same direction between Germany and, for example, France. In France, the role of intellectuals is much bigger. The relevance of intellectuals in the political sphere is acknowledged. Politicians react to intellectual proposals. Even in Italy, it's now during the last years it changed a bit under Berlusconi's regime. But before it was, for example, possible that Pier Paolo Pasolini in the 70s wrote a big article in La Repubblica, and Andreotti, the minister-president, answered with a similar long article in La Repubblica. This would not happen in Germany. Yeah, so Germany is a little in between the Latin countries in general, also in Southern America, have a closer relation between intellectuals, philosophers, essayists, yeah, writers, and political action. The Anglo-Saxon countries, United States and Great Britain, have quite separated spheres of politics on the one hand and intellectual life on the other. And Germany is somehow in between, it seems to me. So okay, and then your second question about the influence. It's difficult to judge this in detail because you never know what would have happened if somebody, some intellectual, did not say this and that. But for example, the strong opposition of the red-green government against the Iraq war, I suppose that this had something to do with influence of at least some intellectuals. You mentioned some of them, Habermas, Günter Grass. I remember very well some evening, how do you say, some dinners with the Chancellor and some intellectuals. I had the pleasure to be at these dinner speeches and dinner discussions, and I got the impression that even this very pragmatic Chancellor Schröder was carefully listening what they had to say. And so there is certainly a certain influence. One shouldn't overvalue it, but a certain influence seems to be there.
我们的时间请再提问好，大概剩下时间不多了。来，哪一位？我到现在好像还没有听到一个女性的声音哎。这一位先，然后是后面戴眼镜的那一位，好吧？来。
Since Dr. Rumling mentioned about American intellectuals, you know, their role in American society, so I was wondering, what do you think about Chomsky? He has done a great deal, you know, giving a very independent voice.
That's the one. 就是我们这样子啊，您是问说 您的意思是说，他说美国的知识分子对于在公共领域里头，其实对美国的影响是绝对不如法国的知识分子的啊。那您说那 Chomsky 怎么样啊？那我们再接2个好不好？就是大概最后2个问题了，最后2个问题了。来，刚刚那位戴眼镜的。
你好，请让我用中文发音。我来自辅仁大学生命科学系。那我想请问的是说，我们刚刚提到说台湾走在民主的路上，现在提建立共识可能太早，现在真的建立一个民主的国家可能太早，甚至建立一个信赖的文化也太早。那我想回到最基本的，那我们如何去建立一个尊重的社会？好，那另外一方面，在以后等这个时间不算太早的时候，身为我们现在这个大学生，那我们该做什么，可以为社会尽一份心力？谢谢。
好，最后的一个问题，哪一位？就是最后一个问题。先有2个，那就最后的2个，好不好？我们再来那位，是男生还是女生啊？请穿绿衣服的最后2位。
谢谢，我是男生。你好，教授你们好，我姓黄，我是阳明大学的医学生。我想请问，教授，那个我们台湾呢，现在，我们都强调自己的历史定位是一个殖民地，所以我们我们有很多过去留下来的冲突，是介在人民跟政府之间的冲突。那能不能请教授从德国的经验给我们台湾一些建议？要怎么样去化解这些过去留下来的冲突，带来原谅跟互信呢？比如说像德国是怎么样在2次世界大战之后去获取其他国家的信任跟原谅？谢谢。
好的。那关于这个题目，about this question, Julian, because he mentioned the colonial past and all that. Probably the focal point would be held in Germany, the Vergangenheitsbewältigung. Yeah, OK. 最后一位，请。
我姓何来自一个很小的国家就是刚才龙教授说过的那个新加坡。
新加坡，欢迎你。
这个林氏先生你好，我们的代表也在这边哈，我不晓得。刚才这个龙教授也很抬举说，这个李先生如果来这边管理的话是怎么样的情况？我相信
我们可以把台湾委外。
对，我相信大概他会很早就进精神病院了，这个他受不了这个环境是这样，我一个很简单的一个问题哈，就是刚才听了这么多关于这个民主制度或者各种那个normative constituents 等等的这些讲法，君主制宪也有很多这个民主制度，在世界上很多国家用就是君主宪政制度，也实行了民主，比方说泰国比方说日本现在的民主，或者是英国也还是以君主宪政。不晓得那个Rumeli 教授对这一个君主宪政的看法是怎么样？还是说现在因为这个已经不合潮流了，不合时宜了在讲这个好像是开倒车的一个说法，或者是说他也有他可以扮演的角色，是不是介于这个一个从完全君主或者完全服从一种威权的过渡也可以？君主宪政是不是也是一个 option 我可能这个问题问得很退步不过我尝试问这个教授的问题。
Julian, can I add one more question? 就是我们既然有一个新加坡的问题，我们再加一个香港的问题，好不好？那是华人世界。Then we have Greater China here. 香港来的朋友有没有问题？苏先生有没有？用麦克风，桌上。
我想请 Julian 呢 ，Dr. Julian 提提对香港那个民主派的那个看法，现在我们也觉得蛮危险的。
明天投票哦 ，Tomorrow's the election
at the end, the most difficult questions, it seems to me. I don't know whether I can answer all of these questions. Well, the first was about a counter-argument, Chomsky's role in the United States. Well, Chomsky is a well-known linguistic scientist and highly respected as in this field. His political contributions are not very well esteemed in the United States. There are some who think he, in the university, in the campuses, who think Chomsky is the intellectual knowing exactly in which direction one should go. But I would say Chomsky has no major role in the political practice of the United States. So this seems to be no counter-argument to me. Chomsky is more in the European countries. There Chomsky has a certain relevance, but I don't think in American politics. The second question about, how can a society of mutual respect can be built, and what role can college students have in building such a society? Well, on the colleges and on the universities, people meet from not only from different regions, different ethnic backgrounds of a certain country, but worldwide. So the idea of university to bring persons together with very different backgrounds, with one common interest, and this is science and humanities, is the idea of mutual respect. If you discuss scientific problems without mutual respect, you can't discuss it, because you don't take the other person seriously. If you are not able to discuss philosophical problems independent from the cultural background you have, you can stop doing philosophy, and so on and so forth. So I would say the scientific academic community is a model for a respective society. It can't exist without mutual equal respect. So in this, Habermas is right. So there's a discourse ethics. Discourse is not possible without mutual respect. So one could say, if you want to develop a society of equal respect, then there is an example of how to develop it, and this is the campus, the college, the academic surroundings. And this has certain impacts in society. You are a member of families. Families may be more bound to the local situation in which they grew up. Your parents may be, and with more with attitudes more adverse to other ethnicities, for example. I don't know. So, but you are part of this family, so you have an influence. Change these attitudes. So, if not the students, who then? So, I would say this is certainly a good idea to think about the role of the academic field for a society of mutual respect and equality. The third question was a little bit also in this direction, if I have it, if I remind it well. But take the example of societies that had a forceful historic change, like South Africa, or Germany after the Second World War, or Eastern Germany after 89-90. Or Spain after the end of the Franco regime, Greece after the end of the military regime, and so on and so forth. So these societies have to develop their own way of integrating different forms of life, different biographies. It is not a solution to these historical problems that you disvalue biographies. Many artists from the former GDR, from the former Eastern German communist countries, have this problem. They told me, they say, I have the impression that 80% of my life has no value anymore because I live in the wrong country. This cannot be the solution. But certainly you can criticize certain action, and if somebody is responsible for spying, for example, or whatever, then this has to be criticized and maybe even punished legally. But the idea that you have to reinvent your life, that you have to begin fully anew, is leading in the wrong direction. I even think that it is not possible to reinvent your life. There's always a certain continuity, connectedness within one's life. You can change values and norms, but gradually, not from one moment to the next. And so, you know, societies in change have to face this challenge, to preserve the integrity of biographies and develop a new society. And we can't judge others in Taiwan, but this is a problem that also Germany faced during the last 2 decades. Constitutional monarchy, so if you ask me personally, I would say no. It is a relict of pre-democratic time, and I don't see the legitimization of a family to have a certain position in a democracy. And this is a strange situation. But I can understand those countries, maybe Great Britain, I don't think that it's still so, but certainly Thailand, where you have a very strong binding, cultural tradition, binding to an idea of a family in charge. And then the task is to combine a democratic system with such a role. Most democratic states, I think, have solved this problem quite well. Spain, Sweden, Great Britain, maybe too. The family is too strong in economic respects. British Queen is one of 3, I think, most wealthy women in the world, and this is a problem in a democracy. But usually a constitutional monarchy is compatible with the democratic system if it makes sure that it is a democratically elected government and the democratically elected parliament who decide in the last resort. And the last question, I can't answer. I will be there again. I have a very good friend from Hong Kong, but still I can't answer this question. Sorry.
关于其中一个问题，就是大学生对于台湾的公民社会，在我们这一个我们大家都很不满意的阶段，有什么可以做的事情？那就容许我为这个基金会要宣传一下了。这个基金会，如果你是第一次来的话，我就可以再讲一次。如果你来过的话，请忍受一下。是在2005年的时候，那个时候距离我们的2颗子弹的分钟还不是太远。那么一群企业界跟知识界的朋友们一直在讨论说，我们对于政治如此的失望的时候，是不是可能对于公民社会的最根本的东西去做一点工作？那也就是思想、公民文化以及对于青年这一代的思想的冲击，所以才出现了基金会这个机构。那这个机构里头就是完全是靠一群奉献的几个企业家，募集了种子基金1.5钱，加上 10几个知识分子来做志工，组成了基金会，4个工作人员来加上60位当时职工，所以这个基金会本身就是因为不满意跟不满足台湾的现况，而希望从根去做起所发生的一个努力。我们到最后绕了半天，可能回到了这个欧洲哲学家卡尔波普所说的，你只有制度，投票制度的话是完全没有用的。如果人的思想以及他的文化素质没有改变的话，对这个基金会所做的事情正是这一件事情。我们欢迎大学生来加入我们共同的努力。那大家也可以看到，在您的这个brochure里头，一张黄一张蓝的，千万不要错过下一次的非常非常精彩的国际名家。请大家注意，我们心目中的国际名家不是最会赚钱的人，我相信Professor 文茂林赚的钱也不是最多的。也不是最有权势的人，我们希望是有思想、有创意，而且他有勇气去挑战主流价值的人，是我们邀请的对象。那你们可以看到，下一次是这一个，我不知道他是怪咖，就是传奇的战地记者是阿奈特 Peter Arnett， 千万不要错过。一场是公开的演讲，你要早一点抢位置，因为台湾没有太大的位置。那同时还有第一次我们推出国际名家私塾，只收30个人，不收第31个，所以请大家尽早。那另外大家看一下手上那个黄色的这个东西，是我们一直在做国际的焦点，但是这是我们第一次想到说，让我们了解一下台湾，用全球的角度来关心一下这个岛屿的发展，所以请大家不要错过。那同时就是加入志工，加入我们的行列，跟我们一起。如果你对于现状不满意，这是甘地说的，你如果对现状不满意 ，you have to do it yourself， 就是不要抱怨，没有什么好抱怨，也不需要唱出来台湾，你就是得做就是了。这是我们这群人已经决定在做的事情。那这个给基金会宣传完了之后，我要再度的 I have to one more time give my gratitude to MediaTek, to Commonwealth, to all the newspapers which have helped us, to Suzhou University, the German department, to German Cultural Center. And most of all, I want to thank the speaker who has come that far, who has been so sincere and so serious and so generous in giving his time and effort and his thoughts and sharing with us. And I really hope that he has a chance for love for this island, that he will come again and we'll see him again. So please give him our warmest applause to Nida Woman. Thank you so much.